So here we are in Project 2, the reading for which is page 9, and then also the primary sources in the back. Well, two primary sources. One, the Code of Hammurabi, the selections of which are reprinted in the appendix and translated, and then from Deuteronomy 21 and 22, which is reprinted on page 13. These two codes. I think the purpose of this should seem pretty clear, that it's to get students to formulate historical arguments using primary sources, and also to give them the confidence to appreciate that they are capable of doing that. They can look at a historical source and make an argument. In fact, if they read a historical source, particularly like a law, it's going to be nearly impossible to not make some kind of argument. I mean, formulating an opinion on the basis of the evidence is formulating an argument, and so that's what they're doing. The page is pretty clear. There's just this one page, page 9, that discusses a little bit about argument and how argument should to be objective, it should set aside biases of all kinds. And I think this begins to suggest what is wrong with bias, because it's not really evident. I think a lot of students, a lot of Americans, live in a culture where they are taught that everything has bias, everybody has bias, and therefore bias is based on my belief, and therefore bias is good. But bias isn't good. Bias is bad. Bias in formulating arguments is bad because bias isn't objective. Well, what's wrong with being subjective? Because subjective is my opinion, it's my perception. And while that's true, that doesn't make it fair or reasonable or accurate or useful. And so bias interferes with the process of arriving at a correct conclusion. And this has to do with a historical argument, just like current argument in a court of law or in a discussion about society or about institutions or practices. I think it needs to be based on objective criteria in order to arrive at a correct conclusion, which is the goal. So here on page 11, and by correct I mean right. I mean correct, right, and good. Those three certainly go hand in hand if they aren't completely synonymous. It's very close. So here on page 11, interpreting historical sources, there are simply questions about the Code of Hammurabi. Are men and women treated equally under the Code of Hammurabi? It's plain to see what men and women were not treated equally. That's objective. That's based on the evidence. And that can be very simply argued. And students do a nice job with this. They appreciate that they are now making historical arguments based on primary sources. And it may be difficult, it may be tricky, but in this case it shows you that it doesn't have to be, and that they are fully capable of doing that. I have an example here from a student from last semester. The question number 1, women and men were treated equally under the law of Hammurabi. She answers, no, men and women were not treated equally under the law of Hammurabi. I ask students always to state their argument at the outset of their answer. Don't just say yes or no. Don't just jump into the evidence. Don't presume that we're having a conversation, because we aren't. I want them to formulate the argument, and here she has done that. She has said men and women were not treated equally under the law of Hammurabi. That's her historical argument, as seen in passage 141, where a man can take his previous wife as a servant. That seems fair. I think her evidence seems fine. You might need more. There may be a different passage that would have been a little stronger, but that answer it's well written, it's clear, and it's well argued. So to me, that's a fine answer. Of course, people have written dissertations on men and women under the Code of Hammurabi, but that isn't what I want them to do. I want them to appreciate that they can make historical arguments, and then to make a historical argument and to state it clearly, concisely, and objectively. In ancient Mesopotamia, a woman could own a business. There's evidence for this in the Code of Hammurabi that they can find. People of different classes were treated equally under the law of Hammurabi. This is one of the many examples in this class where students need to rethink or re-understand a common term. Common term class in modern American society, I think to most people means wealth. But historically, class doesn't mean wealth at all. Class means something about legal status. And clearly in the Code of Hammurabi, women had a different legal status than men, kings had a different legal status than slaves, free men, and so on. So the idea of class kind of needs to be unlearned and relearned. But it's a good example for them, for students, that they need to set aside their preconceptions if they hope to understand something about history. And this is an important example, I think, because it comes up time and again, class, the function of class, the role of class, in not just the ancient world, but the early modern world and pre-revolutionary world, and so on. And then question B, can historians have the moral authority to judge whether or not a law was harsh, unfair, or unreasoned? This is a different kind of question. And for this one, I didn't have a word count. With this one, I think that this is the heading for the questions to follow. But this heading is a little bit different. It's really asking, do we need to accept this very weak position that so many people have learned in school and in popular culture in the United States recently, that different cultures, different people. Well, different times, different places. Well, that's what they do. They believe it is good for them. If that's the laws they had, then those laws must have been fair to them. I have heard that so many times from my students, and I recognize it. I don't just hear it from my students. I see it on TV. I see it in History Channel. I see it in popular culture of all kinds, in music and in movies and in politics. This moral relativism that runs so deep, and to me, it's really moral cowardice, is what it is. It's an unwillingness to come out and say there is a right and wrong. That it's wrong to buy and sell people and to pull babies away from their crying mothers and selling them like property. That's wrong. It was wrong in the past, it's wrong in the present. So now slavery, I don't mean to suggest that the slavery under Hammurabi was very similar to slavery in the United States in the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries, but still, I think there are absolutes in this way, and I think there have to be. Because if there aren't, then on what basis are we evaluating our own laws? On what basis are we functioning as citizens and governing ourselves? On what basis are we voting? On what basis are we establishing right and wrong? Of course, there's so much gray area between your freedom and my freedom and so on, but there is a common historical foundation of right and wrong. And I think to say, well, back then it was okay to make a girl marry her rapist, which a lot of students will say in answer to this part B, I think that's cowardly, and I think that it's wrong. And this student actually has a good answer, because here on page 13 then there are these two selections from Deuteronomy, partly to demonstrate that it's not only the Code of Hammurabi, it's also the Judeo-Christian tradition that has these kinds of laws and had these kinds of laws, and that could not be reasonably argued to have been just. And just because people had them, it actually doesn't mean that they enforced them. I mean, these two laws that are described on page 11, I don't know that they were commonly enforced in Jewish society, no matter how traditional and how conservative it was. But in any case, the questions about those laws then really ask, are these laws fair? And I think it's important that students try to identify sort of the scope of their authority, their moral authority, their authority to interpret, their authority to argue. With argument meaning an opinion that's based on evidence, so an objective opinion, an opinion that would hold up in a court. And here with question 1 on page 15, Is it possible to argue that some of the laws from Hammurabi and Moses are unfair or unjust? Or does a historian need to stay always aloof and accept that other people had other customs which might have been fair to them but not to us? Which this alternative, the second part of this question, is the tendency of most American students to say, well, if they believed it, it was true for them. Well, if the law was in place, then they must have believed it. But this student has a good answer. She says, of course it is possible to argue that some of these laws are unjust. If you consciously practice morality, it is impossible to justify the marrying of a rape victim to the perpetrator. It is unreasonable to assume that she or her family would believe that this outcome was fair or just. This is one problem with the position that, well, what was right for them was right for them, and that's different from us. That we don't know that it was right for them. Just because this law was carved into stone doesn't mean that everybody thought it was fair or just. And it seems extremely unlikely to me that if this law were enforced, compelling a rape victim to marry her rapist, it seems very unlikely to me that in all cases that the raped woman, young woman, would think that this was a fair and the right thing to do, or that her mother would think that, or her friends would think that. Just because it's in the law doesn't mean that it is. So what is the criteria on which we can do this? Now, what I'm not suggesting is that historians have to go around saying these people were right and those people were wrong. But I think that it is within the authority of the modern thinker to apply these values to other societies. In fact, we have to. And if we don't, where do we start applying? Like if I vote on a law on cockfighting, I don't participate in that, and nobody in my community does, and I haven't ever been around people who do. But it's an issue in Louisiana and in New Mexico and in some national cultures. It's a practice. Do I have the right to tell them what to do or not? Is that inhumane? Is it wrong? Well, somehow I have voted on that issue a couple of times in my life. On what basis do I have the authority to make that determination that cockfighting is wrong? Well, there is an underlying principle that I think that needs to be distinguished from the cultural bias, and certainly, to a certain extent, cultural relativism is not bad. But I think there's moral relativism that says, well, then anything is good if people did it. To me, it's absurd. And this is what people often say. Now, by the way, this student uses second person, and she shouldn't use second person in her writing. She said, if you consciously practice morality. But I think her answer is strong. I think her answer is good, because she's accepting the authority to evaluate right from wrong on some objective evidence. And I think that this objective evidence is essential. I think that people have to have that. Now, not applying to everything, and accepting that there are lots of gray areas between right and wrong, and that between cultures and different interpretations can be valid, and contradictory interpretations can both be correct, and so on. So it's complicated, but I think that it's important to establish early on that students have to have the authority to make arguments, to formulate arguments, to interpret evidence, and to stand on that evidence. And that's what this student has done by saying that she finds it extremely unlikely that even during the time of Moses, that all the people who were subject to this law found this law just or fair. And I think that's got to be true. The same is true today. So this section is like this whole first chapter, is really the development of the principle of argument, of objectivity, of bias, and those terms, to in part for students to relearn what history means, how history works, and what critical thinking is and means. My old advisor at the University of Oregon used to say that history is like a court of law, and I mentioned this once before in the first video lecture. But I think it's apt, and I think it's insightful, and it's very helpful. If the way that a court of law can argue something is also the way that historians are required to argue. Okay. See ya.